Hi, and welcome to Deep Dialogues, 12 extraordinary conversations I'm having with amazing female soul stewards who at this time are transmitting their unconditional love, empathy, and compassion about the creation of a new level of living, and therefore helping us to form ideas about a brave new world that we can create together. Have a wonderful time listening in. For those people who are tuning in already, welcome, welcome, welcome. You know who I am. I'm sitting here with the wonderful Ruth King, whom I'm going to formally introduce you to in a moment, who is an absolutely fascinating human being, working in a very specialized field, but in a beautifully human and resourceful and charitable way. Ruth has an emotional resonance which is extraordinarily deep. And it's a great honor to be with her this evening. So how are we doing?
Has an emotional resonance, which is extraordinarily.
Right, so we're getting there, I think. Gosh, it's quite complex, this process. And Claire, how wonderful to see you, and Sarah and Anna. Lots of people are joining us. How exciting. And so, you know, we're just getting things, those of you who are tuning in, we're just getting things organized technically so that you can see us and hear us and we can see each other and hear one another. Ruth is on the northeastern seaboard of the US, which of course, as we know, is experiencing many major tropical storms at the moment as a result of a hurricane going over going from the south through Florida, and she's in the southerly states. So good evening, Dirish and Charm, all these wonderful people who are coming in. Okay, so welcome, welcome, welcome. And before much ado, I need to, Sabine, lovely to see you. And Stephen has joined us. Okay, I could go on and on and on, couldn't I? So let me introduce you to the wonderful Ruth King. So Ruth, I'm just going to share with everybody your bio, if I may. So Ruth King is a celebrated author and educator, life coach and meditation teacher of the Theravada Buddhism tradition. Ruth is also the founder of the Mindful of Race Institute, offering teachings that weave mindfulness-based principles with an exploration of racial conditioning, its impact, and our potential in the field of understanding how we can align with a greater truth, a greater honesty, and a less judgmental or conditional attitude towards people of different races. Ruth sits on the Teachers Council at the Spirit Rock Meditation Center and teaches mindfulness meditation retreats worldwide. She has a master's in clinical psychology from John F. Kennedy University, Orinda, California, and is the author of several major books, including her most recent, Mindful of Race, Transforming Racism from Inside Out, which I've been reading studiously, and it is the most extraordinary book, alongside another book that she wrote, which is called Healing Rage. So for all of you wonderful people who are tuning into Ruth for the first time, don't go on to Amazon right now, but here's a little bit of a spell spinning for you. Welcome, Stephen, welcome, Wendy. So the wonderful, wonderful Ruth. So when did it become a necessity in your own journey to be so wonderfully outspoken about racism?
I don't know. I don't know if there was a defining moment. Because I was just raised in an atmosphere of protest around how Black lives, right? And so being raised in the civil rights and Black power movements in South Central Los Angeles, witnessing my mother and grandmother all being involved in various ways, and just dealing with how to take care of their own children and protect them from police brutality, from poverty, from not being able to get jobs. Yeah, and just looking collectively of how that wasn't just an individual experience, right? So there was something early on in recognizing both there's this individual kind of hardship, if you will, and then there's this collective weight around race that was just like just like the air we breathed growing up. In addition to there being just exquisite creativity and beauty, was all a part of the mix. So I don't know if this has really ever not been a part of my recognition, sensitivity, heartbreak, heart opening experience. As a young person, as an elder now, it still is, I often say, why are matters of race still matters of concern? And what does that have to do with you? I think that the what does it have to do with you part of turning inward to see how we cultivate a capacity to be in relationship with this in a holy way, in a healthy way, in a wholesome way. I think early on, that was kind of a cry of the heart around how this came together, how this integration occurred in me, because I saw a lot of suffering growing up within my family, people struggling, people, I remember vivid images of my great-grandmother just pacing in worry about how to protect her children. And the biggest heartbreak for me was that I was unable to comfort her. At the age of 7, I wanted to and didn't know how to. But I'm just saying all this to say that early on, we get shaped into a relationship with the harsh reality of race and racism. At least that was the case in my growing up, for many like me growing up. And I think we are deciding breath by breath, moment by moment, how to be with that, how to deal with it, how to avoid it, how to numb it, how to, I think that's a big part of our landscape and orientation growing up. So,
because your mother was part of the civil rights movement, wasn't she? And was influenced
very active,
hugely by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If I may, I just want to remind everybody that we are in celebration of a remarkable man who has just recently passed, who was part of the civil rights movement in the form of the great John Lewis, who worked with, as a very young man, he was only 19, I believe, when he joined the civil rights movement and worked alongside Dr. King, who of course wasn't a relation of yours. I found it amusing that every time I saw your name, I was thinking of Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll say he was my, brother or relative. It depends on what situation I'm in, where I can, where I might want to just claim a serious relationship. But no, we're not really related. But I love that his last name and mine are both King. So
yeah. It's interesting because you both were teaching a sacred he was teaching, you are teaching a sacred sovereignty. So it's interesting that you should be called King. What is your ancestral lineage? Do you have any identification of how far you can go back?
My son has done quite a bit of ancestry work that I haven't totally tied into. But according to the tree he's investigated, there's there's Native American, there's Choctaw lineage, there's Black, there's Creole, there's European, Ireland, I think it was said in the tree. I don't remember exactly, but definitely a hybrid and embodiment of a lot of intersections around race, which is true of so many Black people, that I know.
And was there anything within the family? I mean, you just spoke about your great-grandmother. Was there anything within the family that was fed to you very specifically that stirred you in trying to find ways of becoming a peace individual, a peacemonger, if you like, within both the African American community, but in the broader racial communities in the world?
I think a pivotal moment was when I saw my great grandmother pacing and just at a loss for what to do. And I think early on in my life, you know, the first book was about rage. So rage was my teacher for a number of years growing up. This kind of spinning in a sense of helplessness and righteousness around what was wrong and pointing it out with a roar, to the point of really just recognizing at the age of 27, after having open heart surgery, that my strategy wasn't working so well, right? But I was still right about it. I was actually dead right about it. So I feel like rage had to be my teacher for a while, and it was making friends with that energy, allowing the truth of the rage that I felt to have a place in my life, but not the ruler of my life. And as most teachers in my life, I end up writing about it, and then I teach about it, you know, so that's been kind of a rhythm with me, a way of recognizing and ripening and understanding of what's happening internal. So I think the process for me has been, it didn't start at being, how do I know I'm a peace builder? It was literally going through the gateway of rage to recognize that you needed the contrast of peace in order to cool the fires and see clearly. And you needed to transmute the energy of rage so that it became light and luminous, so that you can see clearly from a seat of stability as opposed to reactivity. So I feel like I've been taught well from suffering. I've been taught well about how to live and how to go beyond the spinning that I saw my great grandmother in, this helplessness in the face of harsh reality, to a sense of hopelessness in the face of harsh reality, because I can bear witness to it without being on fire in a bad way, right? So using that energy, honing that energy to a place of light, luminosity, stability, so that I could respond. I think another illuminating place for me was recognizing the impact of my actions and how it had a reverberating effect. I could see it in my relationship with my son, you know, the impact I had on his life, or the you know, how we shape people, especially those we love, through our actions. And when we concern ourselves with our impact, amazing things start to happen, because we start to see that, oh, it's like the airwaves, you know, when I do this, that happens. I'm planting that seed, this blooms. And as I became more sensitive to my impact on others, and my sensitivity to how much pain I actually walked with and ignored for so long, and as I woke up to that, how tender my heart was, that my desire was no longer around, you know, hurting people, because I was so intimately connected with what hurting felt like. So there was something about that that really started to shift me into a place of pause and honor and a deeper respect for other people that I'm dealing with, and a tolerance, more understanding and heart capacity for people that are raging, because I know what that world is like. I know what that energy is like, and I know what's possible if it's embraced with a sense of kind regard.
Beautiful. And so as we review the contemporary landscape, particularly in the certain amount of social chaos that is taking place within major American cities throughout the world, and particularly in relation to Black Lives Matter. Do you have a particular rationale, or do you have an inspiration, or do you have maybe two very principal strategies that you would like to just simply, in a sense of waving your wand, and I mean that very meaningfully, I don't mean that in a casual or absurd way, of creating magic so that people become aware again of the proportion and the capacity of their rage, so that they can actually find ways of being able to own it, honor it, name it, and move through it to further peace? Is there anything that you can say?
Yeah, I don't know if I would start at the place of rage, although I think that there's something we can begin to give our attention to, because I think when people are enraged, they're not always happy about it. I mean, I think it doesn't feel good to lose control. I mean, it's not the desire of most people to go to that place. And I actually think the rage is kind of that we see in relation to what's happening in many states here is just kind of a reflection of something a lot deeper that needs attention. I think what we're seeing in our society right now are what I consider to be karmic blooms. It's a bloom of consciousness there that's happening around seeds that were planted many, many years ago. We're always planting seeds with our thoughts and actions. And so what we're seeing now is an inflammation of consciousness exploding in its bloom from not current consciousness, but generational consciousness around race and racism and what happens to dark bodies. So, you know, I think it's when people talk about how do we fix that, there's no, you know, once the seed is planted, you know, sometimes you can't go back and just uproot it. You know, you have to start with how you are in relationship with the current bloom. So I think we need to understand that these seeds were planted and why they were planted, and to understand our connection to that kind of gardening that's been taking place for generations, and to recognize our place in that, our contribution to that historically, and what rage inheritance and racial inheritances we have all embodied, and that those seeds are inside us. And if they're not attended to, they bloom into, you know, innocence, ignorance, whatever you want to call it. But dark bodies and a lot of other people are deeply affected by the unconsciousness, the ignorance, the innocence of these blooms. So when I'm seeing rage exploding with people, it's like that's one level to look at it. But what I'm most wanting people to understand is that this is a system that is held well in place through greed, through hatred, through delusion of how things are, through, you know, any number of things, and that cycle of harm and hate needs to be interrupted, and that we each have work to do in interrupting the habitual or the repetitive motion injury of this chronic way that we keep seeing these recurring patterns, because the blooms and the seeds the blooms are blooming and the seeds keep getting planted.
Yes, yes.
So my heart.
Could you just inform us even deeper in relation to the seeds that you're referring to? Because you know them extraordinarily well, and many of our listeners, there are quite a lot of people out there listening in that they can intuit. But could you perhaps literalize what you mean by those seeds?
Well, what I'm talking about is how we have been conditioned around ourselves as racial beings. So we've all been programmed, if you will. We have been indoctrinated into belief systems and views about our racial value and superiority. I talk about this quite a bit in terms of looking at systems of dominance and subordination
Yes,
in
but
our
you see, I
social
would
and
regard
political.
this as being, I mean, this is very significant information, but I would regard it as being surface level. And I wonder if you could actually go down into the seeds and perhaps even talk about how they create roots. What is there deep, deep, deep in the underbelly of systemic racism?
Well, let me ask you, because you seem to be looking for something I have a sense you probably have some thoughts about. So what are you sensing that you
Well,
think this is rooted in?
you've talked about the bloom, which is beautiful, but I wonder if you could actually reveal what you sense the karmic lesions to be that are now coming to the fore because of the extraordinary volatility of the world that we're living in, as we see one system of governing evidently no longer governing in the effective way that it did 150, 200, 300, 400 years ago, if indeed it was effective. People just simply agreed with it in a blind faith fashion. And today, the transparency of our lives is bringing us to a new reality. So I'm really talking about the seeds of the karma.
Well, the seeds of the karma that I would highlight would be that this very nation of the United States was built on taking the land of Native American people, of killing a whole slew of people. We're talking about the people that came here and took the land, abused the people, killed the people, brought people here to be enslaved, onto this current day manifestation of over militarization of the police and incarceration. To me, the deep seed is a seed of hatred around dark bodies and how their bodies have been exploited in this country, that the very nature of this country was built on that kind of subordination and hatred, and not even hatred so much, but indifference, but chattel, we're talking about people being used as property. These are deep seeds in our psyche. These are deep psychic karmic seeds that are planted that produce a certain mindset and belief system in people, white people, of superiority, of domination, of control, of subordination, of deep hatred to this day. So to me, that's kind of the whole country was founded on the principle. We can even look at the whole activity of capitalism is dependent upon exploiting bodies of people. And we can see this kind of dominant, subordinated dynamic replicated throughout the world. We can look in India, we can look in Europe, we can look in Africa. We don't have to look far. We can look in our own families around how gender, for example, gets played in terms of dominance and subordination, and our collusion with that for any number of reasons in order to maintain favor or to be membered. I'm reading right now the Mary Trump's book about never enough and never too much. I can't remember the name of it, but just really speaking psychologically and historically, generationally, about how the mind is shaped based on what's rewarded, what's punished, what's greed, what's hatred, what's delusion. So to me, there's a recycling of consciousness around this, karmicness around this, that has not been attended to, and unattended, it just keeps planting itself through our minds, our thoughts, our beliefs, our ignorance, our innocence. It just gets passed on to the next generation. And then we pick up the baton and carry it unless we interrupt the habituation.
Thank you. That's wonderful. There's an explanation. It's absolutely wonderful. And we both know that when people are startled by truth, when they feel naked by truth, made naked by truth, and therefore held in a beautiful beautiful position of vulnerability, they begin to see the light of transcendence. Are there any particular words or techniques or sensations or illuminations that you can use as hope-filled messages for what you would like to see within, and I'm thinking very specifically about the African American community in the United States, because it's a community that I feel for and care for, with all of my friends who are within that community. And then, of course, beyond that, the collective of my brothers and sisters, I feel very dearly about it. So any words of inspiration?
Yeah, I do think that one of the things I talk about in the book is how we're all good individuals. And let's just say we all have good intentions for the most part when we are moving in the world. None of us want to be harmed. None of us want any kind of disturbance. All of us come from families. All of us have probably experienced some degree of trauma or upset or major loss or kick in the gut or blow to the heart. This is what happens to us as humans. And we're also racial beings. We also are born into systems of race. And all races, while created equal, are not treated equally. And I think what needs to happen is because we're in structures of dominance and subordination socially, globally, that we need to move towards a direction of synergy. And what that means is that the people that are in dominant positions are challenged with looking and interacting with their dominance in ways that they are recognizing their impact on other people, not so much at the individual level, because we're all good individuals, but at the racial collective level. So when you talk about having friends that you know that are Black people, and many of us might have friends that are Black people, to me that's an individual knowing. It's a different kind of knowing and responsibility when we identify at the collective level. And most people of color can identify readily as groups of races, right? Because what they share in common is oppression. But many white people have not done that work. They see themselves as individual good people, not as a white group of people with a collective pattern, history, and impact on the rest of the world. So part of coming into synergy is when white people begin to do the work of collective, right? And people of color begin to do the work of distinction and they're, within the body of color, then we're kind of in a place where we can begin to have a conversation. So my hope around this is not so much that we all are in a room getting along and, that there's representation. My hope is that there's consciousness, because when we raise our awareness of our impact and when we begin to recognize that collectively we all have racial impact and we want that to be wholesome, we don't want to do harm, we don't want to continue the seeds that are creating bitterness and rebellion. When that work starts to get done, which is most of what my work is about, where we begin to recognize ourselves as racial beings, recognize our impact at the collective level, and begin to start working at the social levels that insist on racial well-being and harmony through policies, practices, politicians, or whatever there may be. So my hope is not necessarily that we get to a place of, kumbaya, but that our awareness is raised enough to where we can stay in the conversation so that we can continue to learn, that we can regulate our nervous system enough so that we're not in reactivity, but that we are maintaining relationship with the topic enough so that we can cultivate a capacity to stay present to just whatever is right here. Because when we lose control, we're not embodied. we kind of become disjointed. There's always a level of embarrassment and shame that comes along with that. So how do we stay in the body, stay in the heart, and stay in the conversation to a place of harmonics? What I love about what you do in working with the voice is in terms of finding your note. It's that territory. It's how do we find our note and stay in residence, in relationship, in the harmonics with being able to have a conversation about race without all of our conditioned reactivity. And the practices of mindfulness, I've found, tend to regulate the system enough so that we can stay in the body, stay present, have a broad view, and cultivate our capacity to shift and dance and move like jazz so that we can do what must be done to heal this just generational insanity that we have that's rooted in such an unconscious hatred that's just pervasive and especially inflamed at this time.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That's extraordinary. And of course, you've moved us so effortlessly and so flowingly into the way that you discovered your own mindfulness practice within Buddhism, and how that encouraged you, stimulated you, inspired you through practice of discovering a way of being able to communicate on a different level of cellular union, so that you would also radiate that force from your body, and that other people would experience it, but always through practice. How did you discover the mindfulness through Buddhism? Where did you turn to? And was it a moment of reckoning, or somebody say, hey, you should read this? How did you discover?
Well, it's funny, because I was in China at the Beijing Women's World Conference. I'm not remembering the year. Was it 95 or 98? Oh, it must have been earlier. And so I did a training there for the conference on generational healing, actually. And I went on a side tour with the group and found myself in front of this 5 to 7 story golden Buddha somewhere. And the place was just packed. And then all of a sudden it wasn't, right? And so who's standing next to me is this Black woman who, and at the time I had long dreadlocks, she had long dreadlocks. We're both looking at this Buddha statue with tears trickling down, and we kind of looked at each other. And she said to me, this is just no kidding. She said, do you meditate? And I'm thinking, who is this? And I said, well, kinda. And she said, where do you live? And I said, oh, I live in the Bay Area, as if anybody in China would know where that is, because when you're in California, of course, you know where the Bay, where the Bay Area is. And she said, well, so do I. This ended up being a woman, Dr. Marlene Schoonover. She's an ancestor now. She was on the board, Black woman, she was on the board at Spirit Rock Meditation Center, and she asked me to come with her one evening to hear her teacher, Jack Kornfield, speak. And I said yes. And I went with her and I heard Jack Kornfield speak. I had done a little bit of reading about Buddhism, but not really. And one of the things that he said that was so really just got in me was he said, this is a practice of you knowing for yourself what the truth is, that you don't need to believe what I'm saying, what the Buddha's saying, what anybody's saying. Just do the practice and see for yourself, know for yourself what these teachings are about. Well, up to that point, I had been, I was raised a Baptist. And so I was kind of in the church where you were kind of, it was a lot of damnation if you didn't follow the rules. And you didn't even know necessarily why, but you knew you better. So I knew it wasn't about that so much for me. But what I did resonate with so deeply was I get to know for myself what the truth is. And that was very profound for me. So I started attending Spirit Rock, and ended up being in a study group that was organized by Dr. Schoonover and Alice Walker and Jack Cornfield and a few other people. We called it 8 Women of Color and Jack. And we met for 10 years as a Sangha, as a meditation community, and learned how, we called it a wisdom circle. And we integrated the teachings and learned about the teachings and shared our lives. And that's when I was writing my first book. And they were all very instrumental, and mindfulness was really coming into play as a practice. The practice of mindfulness informed how I wrote the book around rage, and how I began to integrate the energy of rage and dissolve the stories around it. And it was just one of those times, Stewart, where it was just, there was such an alchemy of beauty and love. The container supported this capacity that I keep talking about, where we can really ripen into a sense of embodied authenticity through the practice of getting ourselves still, being with the breath, understanding how the senses are impermanent, how what happens to us is not personal, how shit happens, and we don't have to necessarily attach to it. These were all like chains being released from my heart and soul, and deeply served as a transmission for how I was seen and relating to the world. And it was very practical. So, and it was also very beyond imagination, because so much of what we learn, as you know, is really in spaces where language wasn't necessarily, is not what's happening. It's a deep experience of deep knowing. So I have learned to trust more and more this territory of transcendence, or this territory of deep concentration, that sometimes we call it in the practice, this territory of surrender and groundlessness and spaciousness, without being attached to the activities of mind or the craziness in society that might be presenting itself moment to moment. So my relationship shifted. It almost turned inside out around my welcome and ease with disturbance, and also with death. So there was just that moment in China really has deep roots in terms of this practice. And then Jack invited me to teach and was my mentor in teaching in the Theravada tradition. I've also studied in the Tibetan tradition and the Mahayana tradition, and have taught a dedicated practitioner program for other people that are studying Buddhist teachings. So it's been a big part of informing my life, informing my work in Mindful of Race, informing my work in generational healing, informing my work in healing rage. So mindfulness and these Buddhist principles infuse my view and support me in creating experiences that are mindfully based and stable, so that we can investigate what's hard about our lives in a way where the heart is not left at the door.
Beautiful. Wow, beautiful. Which brings us to the glory of the sacrament of the heart and heart healing. So much of your book is about heart healing, which is one of the most illuminating aspects. There are many illuminating aspects, but that touch me so deeply. For those of you who are just tuning in, ladies and gentlemen, this is the wonderful Ruth King, who has written a series of books. One I have in front of me, Healing Rage, but also an extraordinary book about becoming mindful about race. And this is primarily the essence of what we're in dialogue about. There was a wonderful quotation that you quoted in the book by Nelson Mandela. When we can sit in the face of insanity or dislike and be free from the need to make it different, then we are free. which for me encapsulated so much of the essence of what you're sharing. And of course, you've drawn us very beautifully to the substance of a quote that, I'm quoting you now. If each one of us can aim our energy toward awakening, non-harming, generosity, and kinship, a world with race, yet without racism, would be created. Wow. And of course, you brought us into the beauty of the way that if we can become fully present to our hearts, if we can become fully activated within our hearts, if we can feel the beauty of the grace and the empathy and the inclusivity of love that exudes from our hearts, we're beginning to address the fundamental nature of what our own healing is about, but also how we can be participative in the collective healing. Yeah. The heart is very important to you, I know.
It is. It is. Yeah, I think the heart was a big teacher. In my 20s, at 27, I had open heart surgery for a mitral valve prolapse, which is metaphoric for me to really pointing to the weight of how I was actually dealing with my life. And the hardness and the harshness and the violence towards myself that I had been living up to that point, not intentionally, but just how I worked and carried and was in relationship to life. It was, so many of us move through life very hardened without recognizing that hardness has impact. So it was coming out of the surgery and being in recovery that taught me, because coming out of surgery, you can feel your life very immediately. First of all, you're happy you took another breath when you wake up out of surgery. But to feel the weight of my life sitting on my chest that had been inside my body was just profound for me. And a deep shakeup of how I needed to recognize that, what I had been doing up to that point was actually hurting me. It doesn't mean that what I was doing didn't need to be done. It meant that the way I was going about it, I was causing myself a lot of harm that I was not in touch with. So to wake up to that was very powerful. It didn't happen instantly. It still happened over time. But the contrast of then and life before then had become very visceral. We talk about the senses. Well, I was really lit up to when I was causing myself harm and when I wasn't, once I came out of that experience of open heart surgery, and noticing that as I opened my heart, I was actually able to do that without so much trepidation, without so many layers, without the rage. What a revelation to know I didn't need that, but that was extra weight.
Amazing.
And the other thing I just want to say about that is that I think we all, each of us carry, we have a rage inheritance, we have a racial inheritance that gets passed on to us. And then we're challenged with how that gets elevated. And we can do a lot at the individual level, but I actually think we need to be in community to really transmute the inheritances of rage and race, and racism especially. So we need to connect with other people. We need to be talking about this. We need to be owning our part in it. And we need to be concerned about something other than our own self-interest, our own individual awakening. We need to awaken the world through our actions and through our good intentions around this.
And this is the time to wake up, isn't it? This is a very...
It is. The earth is cracked open. It's yeah.
And so within the breath and the grace and the, I guess, charity of what you've just shared in that last moment of that sentence, that if we can really move into healing our own processes, but in the light of the fact that when we heal, we're also contributing factors to a communion of healing, and thereby empathy really begins to restore and re-evoke a level of spirit in our communion, which is full of all of the intransigence of the human being and human nature, but at the same time where we begin to see true transcendence taking place because of the level of honesty that is expressed in that space.
Exactly.
You know, I'm
That's well said.
reminded of a retreat that I did many years ago in the area of the Dead Sea in Engedi, where on one level I had a group of Palestinian women, on the other a group of Israeli women, and the theme of the retreat was grieving. And when we first arrived, nobody would talk to one another. In fact, all that lived in the space was hundreds and hundreds of years of individual and ancestral hatred. And so through a series of practices, through a series of embodiment processes, one of which was everybody building an altar to their ancestors, we began to see the consanguinity between all of the ancestors. And gradually, the waters broke. It was very extraordinary. And therefore, everybody was actually able to hold in honesty, in peace, and in acceptance all of the pain that ancestors and they had literally been through. So I'm here, you know, I'm just simply relating to the vastness of what you're sharing. And, you know, I noticed also the wonderful quote in your book, which is a quote from Jean Houston, who was on Deep Dialogues with me 2 weeks ago. Change the story and you change perception. Change perception and you change the world. And the instrument of what that change is all about, as we know, is not just simply a mental body function. It's about going into the deepness of what you refer to as being kindness, and how kindness is the water of humanity. I wonder if you can open up the possibility of what that phrase is.
Can you repeat that phrase?
That kindness is the water of humanity.
The kindness is the water of humanity. Yeah. Yeah, I think what I'd like to do is go back to this story you just told about the altar creation. And I'll get to the water piece because I think it's related. But what was profound about you sharing that story is the fact that they were in a co-creation of something that mattered to them. And this kind of gets to the point. I mean, I think I talked to you about this a few conversations back about the role of artistry as cultural medicine, and that when we are creating something very pure and authentic that resonates or brings us into harmony with our note, then it has transmission. It has a way of pulling together things that we couldn't think our way into doing just by using our own minds. The idea of creating altars where people could then see what they actually share in common creates a certain harmonic that I think is really profound. And a big piece of what feels healing to me these days is for us to be in the business of creating whatever that artistry is. And I see it as a gift, and I also see it as a practice. The gift where we recognize that we are a gift to the world, and also the practice of ripening that gift. And what it does, I believe, through my own experience of writing, is what writing has brought to me. But also the choreograph of groups just finding their way, the dance of that kind of improvisational movement coming together to create something we just can't know until we're in it. There's something about trusting that just makes a lot of sense to me. And when we surrender ourselves to the gift that we are, And we offer that out as our generosity, as our cultural medicine, as our contribution to something bigger than ourselves. Even if we don't quite trust that's what it is, we're in the business of giving it. To me, that represents a certain water, a flow of generosity in our communities that need the watering of new seeds of self-authorship, of authenticity, of deep care, and of the generosity that serves healing, not just self-interest. So I think that's my roundabout way of talking about that line of water is kindness is the water of humanity. Yeah, I think we are all in a dance of creation. We all have a voice in it. We all have a gesture and expression in it. And when we can be true to that, then I think a lot of things can line themselves up.
And I also, as you share with us, I'm reminded of the fact that spontaneously the women sang as they created the altars. So although the objective was co-creative, the altars were individually created. However, through the harmony of song, they somehow, even though the Palestinian women were generally speaking singing their song and the Israeli women were singing their song, the harmonies then interwove. And what was interesting, and I feel that this is one of the inspirations that you're sharing with us about the creative act, what you referred to as the artistry, is that we become removed from the central focus of our cerebral cortex. We go into a deeper part of our beings through sensation and through sensory awareness, so that we stop thinking so much. We move into feeling. And as a result of this, there is a sacred communion that opens in a deeper part of our bodies that brings about whatever the creation is, but at the same time brings about the preternatural aspect of what creation is all about, which is often seen to be transcendent or out-of-body experience, where often supernatural things tend to take place. I mean, I'm thinking of a particular actor who's a very well-known actor who won so many Oscars. It's untrue. It's actually an Irish actor called Daniel Day-Lewis, whom I helped when he was very young and playing Hamlet at the National Theatre, where he actually saw his own father's ghost, not Hamlet's father's ghost, because there's a scene at the beginning of the play where Hamlet begins to recognize the lamentable nature of the state because his own father comes and speaks to him about how he was poisoned. Well, Daniel was actually seeing his own father on stage, and that shocked him into another out-of-body experience that he actually almost forgot that he was playing Hamlet, and indeed found it very difficult to recover from that. Went into, did not fulfill the repertoire. Recovered by going off into Ireland, into stillness and into ritualized forms of behavior, which I helped him with. And then he began working on screen, but never worked on stage again. The level of dimension that is necessary to play on stage is vastly different when you're playing on screen, because you're not playing on screen, you're playing in front of cameras. And the scenes can be very shortly lived. The wonderful spiritual teacher Matthew Fox said, "An open heart is the ultimate sacrament. This is when we truly know God as a superposition for all spirit and from all things." And it feels as though the wonderful symphony of what you're describing, initially by the identification of what challenges exist within the African-American community and other races beyond, how if we move into not being fearful of the outrage of rage, but of moving into an acceptance of what this is all about in meaningful ways, as you were saying, not through reactivity, but through response-worthy actions, and where stillness is employed, that we move deeper into the heart, and thereby there is a divine healing that takes place.
Yeah, and I actually, to me, what you're describing is very much part of the mindfulness practice itself.
Yeah.
That begins with a deep connection with the senses of the body and the breath and of feelings. And then we are able to cultivate enough stillness in the body to begin to investigate our relationships with our thoughts and emotions, and also our understanding of the patterns that can support either freedom or restraint and creativity and all of these other possibilities out of a concentrated mind that can be still and vast and empty. So those to me, those are the riches of mindfulness that supports our a field of creativity that allows us to author our lives and our relationships in ways that support a much larger field than we in our minds can imagine.
As I listen to you, I'm just checking the chat box and seeing if there are any questions. And please, ladies and gentlemen, leave questions as we move into, we're just gently wading into the latter part of our conversation. There is a question for you, Ruth, from a wonderful lady called Lisa. Is there a way that we can today apologize on behalf, is there a way that we today can apologize on behalf of us and our ancestors involved in racism?
You can apologize. So I'm assuming this is a white person who wrote the question.
This is a white person, yes.
Yeah. Here's what I would like to say. I think apology is fine, but it becomes even more soulful when white people have done work with other white people around whiteness. I think the biggest gift that white people can give other oppressed races is an understanding of whiteness and its collective impact, dialoguing, understanding, uprooting those patterns with other white people. Sometimes people ask, an apology comes under the realm of, can I be an ally? And there's nothing wrong with that, but the best way to be an ally is to understand whiteness, understand collective, and interrupt those patterns of harm. And you can do that without ever apologizing. That could be the biggest apology. I certainly wouldn't turn down an apology, but I think it can be more, I think the biggest offering would be to understand whiteness.
Is to understand?
To understand whiteness, to be with other white people in understanding racial conditioning and how it has produced patterns of whiteness that has impact collectively on the world. That's important. For example, there was when I was in Charlottesville and I was working with a group of people just before the killing of the young girl doing a rally around Lives, Heather. And the mayor came on and said to people, the next day, we have to get these white supremacists out of our community, right? And the question for me was, where are they going to go? These are people's brothers, fathers, uncles, sons. The work has to be with white people talking to other white people around how that's not acceptable, as opposed to people of color carrying the weight of having to point that out. That's what I call a real ally and an apology.
That's fascinating, because this is a very novel way of approaching the entire conversation. I feel that, the points of illumination are absolutely fascinating. Is this going to be the substance of your next book?
We shall see. Is that a question, or are you suggesting?
I'm intuiting, I think.
Okay, that would be you. Yes.
It's, what you're talking about is so utterly vital, but is immensely volatile, because it's something that you point out in your mindfulness book, that very few areas of white society really consider the essence of what you're sharing.
Well, what's interesting to keep in mind is that I'm reminded of, and what has kept me and so many generations of my people going, is that there is some evidence of the contrary. For example, I'm running a year-long racial affinity group development program that I started off as a pilot. And as it turned out, there was such an explosion of interest. I have over 300 people now signed up for that program, representing 44 racial affinity groups. I'd say 75% of them are white. So I think there's a deep thirst, especially at this time in history where the earth has cracked open and we're all falling in, regardless of race, and trying to hold on to something. Some of that could be a part of this interest. I've certainly lived long enough to see many life cycles of people, white people, being interested in race. And then when the news cycle changes, then we're onto something else. But for people to commit to this program for a year, to do monthly work with their own race, being guided into looking at their racial conditioning, I'm okay with that, you know? I feel like that's a deep groove, a generational lineage of seeds that are being planted that I think will bloom some different fragrances, sensations, unique flowers in the years and decades to come. That feels good.
This is amazing. Ruth, unfortunately, we've come to a point of completion in our hour-long conversation.
Of course.
But thank you so much for all the wisdoms that you've shared with us. This has been really very extraordinary, and I look forward to reviewing our video and seeing the wisdoms that are pouring forth. And thank you. I would love to have a continued conversation with you at some point in the future, if that's possible.
Thank you for having me, and thank your audience for chiming in.
I will.
With you. Yeah.
I have lost a certain section of the audience, but if you can stay where you are for a moment, I think I may be able to recover. Something technical went strangely wrong just then, but please just stay where you are, and thank everybody for being present.
I will stay right here. All right then. Thank you so much.
Come back to you in a moment, darling. Thank you so much, and namaste.
All right.